This program was produced by and first broadcast on Radio Hawke's Bay, a community access media station. Thank you to New Zealand On Air for making this type of programming possible.
Astrologers around the world are heralding big shifts in 2024. The influences of the planets affect us collectively, and they are creatively articulated by one of these astrologers, Mr. Dan Waits. Dan is very gifted at illustrating the long cycles and the historical patterns of how the planetary alignments influence us culturally and psychologically. This interview was pre-recorded in early February 2024, and I enthusiastically recommend you check out his astrological masterpieces on his YouTube channel, World Astrology Report. Greetings, celestial friends, and welcome to Astrology with Wendy. It is episode 13 and is our first YouTube video podcast. I am Wendy Forman, and a local Hawke's Bay astrologer, your host, and with our special guest today is Dan Waits. Dan is a consulting astrologer, researcher, and content creator focused on the mundane and natal astrology. Dan's goal is to use astrological wisdom and historical research to understand the times we're living through and help more people cross the threshold into a magical cosmos. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Wendy.
Yes, and we're getting New Zealand educated all about World Astrology Report. So your YouTube channel has been flying and gaining in popularity as the months go by. I've been watching you for a while, and it's fantastic to see the number tick over. So what are you're up to about 35,000, 40,000 now? Close?
I'm at about 31,000 subscribers at the moment.
31,000,
yeah.
That's great. That's fantastic. And your work, as far as you're very creative, and the content creation, and for our listeners, I just want to say that to check out Dan's YouTube channel, which is called World Astrology Report. And Dan puts together fantastic videos, superb imagery to help illustrate what's going on and relating it obviously to the astrological aspects. So Dan, you're also a writer, and you have created a World Astrology Report on Substack as well, where you are going to be updating, I imagine, quite frequently as you move towards greater content creation. And for our listeners and watchers, you can visit worldastrologyreport.substack.com and read some of Dan's more recent articles. So Dan, the first thing I want to just let our listeners know that you have this insightful understanding and a way of explaining the long-term cycles and the historical evidence of astrology at play. And that interest, I'm just curious, from somehow, what was the trigger for you to all of a sudden say look at the historical perspective using astrology?
Well, I've always had an interest in history, or at least for a long time. But that predates my interest in astrology by a long way. And I think what really got me to take historical astrology really seriously was the pandemic in 2020, which coincided with a very big planetary conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, and there were other planets involved as well. And that really blew my mind. I was already interested in astrology, but just seeing how this huge historical event had lined up so perfectly with planetary cycles, it really captured my imagination, and I really became completely obsessed at that point in seeing how previous events and previous trends and things that happened in history might also be described by these cycles. And what I found in doing a lot of research into this stuff is that you can view history through this lens, and it gives you an entirely new and insightful perspective into history and how things change.
And taking that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is going to bring me to my next question, which is to explain this synodic cycle for our listeners, because we'll be referring to that as outer planets conjoin together out in the solar system, and that triggers a whole new cycle. So just leading on from that, if you would mind explaining to our listeners the meaning of a synodic cycle?
Yeah, of course. So what we're doing in astrology is observing the movements of the planets and the sun and the moon from the perspective of Earth. So, Earth is revolving around the sun, and so are the other planets. And we're looking at where they are sort of in their cycles from the perspective of Earth. And the different planets move at different speeds, going from Mercury, which really whizzes around the sun, all the way out to Saturn, which was traditionally the outermost planet known, that moves obviously very slowly compared to Mercury, and then even going even further to the newer planets that we've discovered in recent centuries. So these planets move at different speeds, and in astrology, we associate different impulses, different archetypes, different tendencies with these different planets. Now, what is a synodic cycle? A synodic cycle is where we take two of these planets and observe their relative motion relative to Earth, and we look at when the two planets are aligned. Say they're both from the perspective of Earth at the same point in the ecliptic, which is essentially the big disk around which the planets are revolving. We look at when they're aligned. This is what we call a conjunction. And this is what we consider to be a kind of seed moment, or the beginning of a synodic cycle. Now, because one planet's moving faster than the other, that planet will, relatively to the other one, kind of whiz around, and over the course of the two planets' movement, they'll make what we call aspects with each other. So the two planets make what we call aspects with each other, which are certain angles during their synodic cycle. And when they make these angles, we tend to see events happening that are of the nature of those two planets combined. So this is really a synodic cycle. The planets make a conjunction, then they continue moving around the ecliptic. One of them moves much faster. They make angles with each other, and then eventually the two planets meet again. And so this restarts the cycle. It ends the previous one, and we get a new synodic cycle. Now, if you're wondering or trying to visualize this and struggling a bit, the best known or the most visible synodic cycle is that of the sun and the moon. The lunar cycle is a synodic cycle. And so when the sun and moon meet, they're having a conjunction, they're aligned. We can't see the moon because the sun is behind. So there's no light bouncing off the moon and into our eyes, essentially. This is where we get a new moon. A new moon is the sun-moon conjunction in the sun-moon synodic cycle. And then when the moon reaches the opposite side of the Earth to where the sun is, we get what's called a full moon, which is what we would say in astrology is the opposition of a synodic cycle. So you can see in a very, very visible way how the sun, or rather the moon's appearance changes as it moves around the Earth relative to the sun, because of course the moon begins at a new moon, and then it waxes. It goes from from a crescent, it gets larger and larger. It reaches its fullness at the kind of peak of the cycle, and then it recedes again, or it wanes, as we say in astrology. So this sun-moon, this lunar cycle is a cycle we would associate with energy and life force. These are the two lights. And you may know, you may have experienced yourself that at the opposition, at the full moon, there can be a lot of a lot of energy in the air, a lot of emotions in the air. You know, you often hear that police report that they tend to get a lot more cases at full moons. Hospitals have a lot more patients. This cycle has reached its fullness. The moon has reached its fullness. It's reached its maximum extent. There's a lot of energy and a lot of emotion in the air. And then following that full moon,
It dissipates.
the cycle ends. Yes, it dissipates, and we get this sort of second half, the waning part of the cycle, which is more of a sort of phase of kind of consolidation and processing.
That's right. And at the new moon, it's always a time for planting. A lot of the farmers follow that synodic cycle, especially here in New Zealand, which is a very agricultural nation, but all around the world, planting on a new moon. It's the tide is with you. So starting new projects as well. I would imagine when people ask you for timing or good timings, usually the moon is a player in that cycle, or what they're looking for as far as a new project or new venture.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're choosing times to take action, you have to pay a lot of attention to where the moon is, what it's doing, and what phase of its cycle is in, because that will give you some information about how things might unfold.
And that space, so just for people that are maybe tuning in and really don't know that much about the movement of our luminaries, the sun and the moon. So the moon changes sign every 2.5 days. And that momentum, that speed, there's none of the other planets, or not even the sun, because the sun needs 30 days to go through a sign. So the moon is the fastest moving body within our solar system and what we look at in mundane astrology. And so, yes, so explaining that synodic cycle of the conjunction of when two planets conjoin, and that's a great illustration using the sun and moon. We also have then the bigger cycles, the ones that, because the sun and the moon happen every month. So we have 12, 13 synodic cycles of the sun and the moon every year. But moving on and outward in the solar system, we're facing bigger conjunctions, longer lasting conjunctions. And we actually have one coming up in April with Jupiter and Uranus.
Yeah, that's right. So the sun-moon synodic cycle, the lunar cycle, is something that everybody knows about, whether you're an astrologer or not, or you're into astrology. But we astrologers consider that the other planets also signify cycles when they're combined in synodic cycles. And as you say, that some of them are all of them actually are much slower than the lunation cycle. So yes, in April, we'll see a conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus. And this is a conjunction that only comes along roughly every 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something that astronomers will be aware of. Probably your average person won't be aware of that, and they won't, think anything of it, and it won't be a date on their calendar. But for astrologers, it's a big deal, because it's the beginning of a new Jupiter-Uranus cycle. And so the things that we see happening around that time are going to reflect the things that Jupiter and Uranus signify, and they're also going to initiate a new 14-year cycle.
Now, does the sign matter of where the cycle begins? So for instance, it'll be in the sign of Taurus, this cycle.
Yes, the sign also matters. So when we're doing our astrology, our world astrology, we're looking at what the two planets themselves signify.
Mm-hmm.
We're also looking at where in the zodiac they're meeting, as you say, the sign. So we have the 12 signs, and the sign will tell us more about where, like, what kind of events we can expect to see. The planets will still do their usual thing, but it will be modified by the sign in which things take place.
Mm-hmm. And so Jupiter is the planet of expansion. it is considered the great benefic, but it also is the planet of excess and blown out proportion. And then you have Uranus, which is the great disruptor that people refer to. So with the characteristic of Uranus being the rebel, the revolutionary, the innovator, and then you have Jupiter's expansion principles next to that, we have both the potential, obviously, to expand innovation related around Taurian matters because it's in the sign of Taurus, but we also can be in excess as well.
Yeah, so we have two planets that have some commonalities in terms of there's some sense of new possibility opening up breakthroughs and so on that you get with Uranus. And Jupiter also has something to do with those kind of themes, and Jupiter's expansion and optimism and freedom and so on. So when you bring these two planets together, they have some kind of affinity, and you do see a lot of cultural and technological breakthroughs. That's one of the things that you tend to see with these planets combining. For example, the last time that they conjoined in Taurus was 1941. Now, Taurus is a sign that we hold to be ruled by Venus. It has to do with things like the material world and the natural world, and things associated with pleasure and the arts, Venusian themes, land and the earth. And Taurus is a very earthy kind of sign.
Mm-hmm. It's also about security. It's also about security.
Yeah, for sure. So at the last time that these two planets met in Taurus, so I said that they meet every 14 years, but they'll only meet in Taurus, well, much more rarely than that. The last time that they did that was 1941, May 1941. And so if we look at that time and see what happened at that time, and one good example of something that happened at that time was the release of the movie Citizen Kane. Now, if you read these kind of best, greatest movies of all times lists, that movie is often at number one. And why is it at number one? Because Orson Welles completely reinvented and expanded what you can do with cinema. He did things that nobody had ever done before. It absolutely sort of reinvented the art form of cinema. And so there's this whole sense of like something revolutionary, something that expands possibility. And where is it happening? It's happening in the realm of the arts, which is one of the areas that we would allocate to Taurus. So that's one example. Another example that happened around that time, the invention of Cheerios, that kind of horrible breakfast cereal.
Fake food. This is all processed food era started, right?
Yeah. And so, Cheerios, it's this very processed, as you say, kind of food, but it was something very new.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Taurus, astrologers will always associate Taurus with food. I'm a Taurus rising and I love food, probably a bit too much. And so we have this new kind of food, this new rather weird artificial concoction called Cheerios coming into the world. But that's just another example of the kind of thing that you can see with these conjunctions.
And interesting because also 1941 was World War II and food shortages. So interestingly enough, that the opposite, or the shadow side, where all of a sudden certain commodities, but luxurious commodities like sugar, was hard to come by.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are different sides to this this kind of conjunction and this cycle, and it's the same with all these cycles because the planets represent broad archetypes, and so they can combine in different ways. And these
So there are. Oh, sorry. Just I was saying, just on continuing on the theme of the conjunctions and how they play out and make themselves evident. I think.
Yeah, so these conjunctions, they can signify cultural and technological breakthroughs. So in other conjunctions, for example, the one in 1969, we had the Apollo landings. In 1983, we had the adoption of the TCP/IP protocol, which was basically the birth of the internet. 1983, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius.
On Sagittarius, which was exploration. Also, Sagittarius, Jupiter, that's all about exploring new horizons.
Yeah, yeah. So this is one way that these conjunctions will play out, and we can definitely expect that in April there probably will be some technological and cultural breakthroughs, particularly around Taurus themes that we've mentioned already. But the other thing is that it can be quite a violent conjunction as well. Uranus is a planet of shocks and of quick releases, of situations changing rapidly, and Jupiter can also just signify expansion or things going big very quickly, or releases. You can kind of see that Jupiter Uranus can be these big moments of an energetic release, and they can be quite violent. So, during the last Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, 1941, in May, this was pretty much the height of the Blitz as well in London.
It was also Vesuvius.
But I would also say I've seen over and over again that these conjunctions have coincided with kind of sparks that really set fire to volatile political situations. And the beginning of revolutions. So there was one of these conjunctions in 1775 as the American Revolution began. The next one was in 1789,
which
the
was
French Revolution. Then we also have had, for example, the last conjunction of these planets was 2010, 2009, 2010, when the Arab Spring broke out, very close to the exact moment when the Arab Spring began in Tunisia. So these actually can be quite volatile. So whilst there are going to be some rather positive things, I think, coming from this conjunction, given the sort of the volatility of the current world situation as well, we might also expect that things are going to be volatilized. There might be some process of, or some sort of spark is being lit in particular situations.
Interesting. Yes, it is a political hotbed in so many corners of the planet right now anyway. And yeah, fuel to the fire, it feels like. And this before and after April shift, I feel as though we're going to look at the world. We're going to look at what was before April 24. And then that's what I feel intuitively.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing to bear in mind is that this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, it's already really in operation. Like, we're already seeing what it has to say. And if you look at what's been happening in Europe in the last couple of weeks, what have we seen? We've seen these enormous disruptive farmers' protests, and you couldn't get anything more, I think,
Taurian.
More Taurian, exactly. Taurian farmers. This is just pure Taurus, and we have farmers protesting and bringing Paris to a halt, and the supermarkets were empty. Yeah, they were trying to, they managed to get concessions from the French government by blockading Paris, essentially. So we're already seeing what this conjunction is signifying. When we look back in the future, this is one of the things that I think people will look back and say, that happened under the influence of this conjunction.
So not only does April have a new synodic cycle starting with, we're working into it over the next couple of months, but there's also Mars-Saturn happening. Now, Mars-Saturn happens a little more frequently than the 14-year cycle that Jupiter and Uranus have.
Yes, that's right.
A little bit more about the.
Take.
Oh, stop.
Yes, so in April we have not one but two synodic cycles starting and ending. Jupiter-Uranus, which we just talked about, but then Mars-Saturn, which is a much faster cycle because Mars is a much faster planet than both Jupiter and Uranus. So Mars and Saturn meet roughly every 2 years. And so this is a very different kettle of fish, so to speak, the Mars-Saturn cycle. Mars is the planet that has to do with taking action, asserting oneself, getting things done, fighting, conflict, etc. Mars is hot in astrology, and Saturn is very different. Saturn is slow moving and cold, and Saturn is about limits and restrictions and
Discipline.
discipline, taking time over things, doing things properly, things that endure, not being in a rush. So Mars and Saturn are very different planets. They signify quite different things. Although in traditional astrology, they were both held to be what's called malefic planets, meaning that they signify events and things that happen in the world that don't tend to feel so great. Doesn't mean that they're not valuable, or we don't learn from them, but they're often, they don't feel to human beings like they're not the kind of things that we really want to happen. But so when we put these two planets together, we have a planet that wants to move. We have a planet that doesn't want to move or wants to put the brakes on. So this is a difficult combination of planets. It can tend to signify the brakes being put on things, restrictions, things not being able to move, and then also great pressure, and then sometimes just downright, say, violent and difficult events, explosions of different kinds, situations of great pressure. It's also often can signify the beginning of work that is to be done. Building structures. Mars is about taking action. Saturn is about structure and reality.
Constructing, yeah.
Constructing, yeah. So there are different ways to look at this, but traditional astrologers tended to view this particular cycle as being one that signified some of the more challenging themes that would run through history. So every 2 years, you get a new one of these cycles beginning. So just to maybe give a couple of examples of what these cycles can do. We had one of these cycles beginning in March 2020. It was very much at the beginning of the whole COVID pandemic. And if you tracked the cycle, I mentioned earlier aspects, so the angles that the planets make with each other. If you tracked this cycle, looked at when the planets made what we call hard aspects, so they're in a 90-degree aspect, or they're opposing each other 180 degrees. We saw major events in the COVID pandemic. We saw new variants of the virus appearing, and all sorts of things like that. So you could trace this synodic cycle, and along with the evolution of the COVID pandemic story. And then the next conjunction of these planets came in. So the last time that Mars and Saturn conjoined was April 2022. So this is the new 2-year Mars-Saturn cycle following the COVID cycle. And this was very much at the start of the Ukraine war. Now I traced what happened with that cycle, and you could see major events in the Ukraine war following the aspects that Mars and Saturn made over the last 2 years. And so now we're about to have a reset and a new 2-year Mars-Saturn cycle beginning, but this conjunction is happening in the sign of Pisces in April as well. So there's a lot going on in that month. And the sign of Pisces, what's Pisces all about? It's a sign that we associate, for example, with the arts, with mysticism. Pisces is kind of like this oceanic sign. It has to do with that sort of ocean of consciousness, connectedness, universalism, these kind of boundarylessness. These are all kind of Piscean themes, literally the ocean and oceanic themes. So Mars and Saturn conjoining in that sign, we're going to see some new 2-year cycle of challenge, probably beginning around Piscean themes. I was talking a bit before about how these conjunctions often will have something to do with situations of great pressure, but also things not being able to move. Mars wants to move and Saturn says no. Yeah, and I'm wondering a little bit about the global trade network. We're already seeing what's going on with the oceans, with the Suez Canal. it seems to me that we might be witnessing the breakdown of that, sort of the global maritime trade network, which has really been sort of the black backbone of globalization for a long time. It seems to be breaking down. It's holding on by a thin thread, unfortunately, and I'm wondering if that might be something that we might see with that conjunction. The other theme that's, I think, been big with Saturn in Pisces has been migration. And you're seeing that theme coming up very loudly in a lot of different parts of the world. And I wonder also about that. I'm
Well,
looking at the
interest
US as
tying in
well.
with Ukraine, just going back a bit, because if you think about all the Ukrainian women and children that left Ukraine from February to, for the months, those immediate months when the war started, or the conflict started with Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a big part of that story. I think over the past year or so, we've seen that
And then the
that
US.
theme getting louder and louder because Saturn moved into Pisces in March, and Saturn is a planet that will tend to exert some kind of pressure in the area that you find it, so that you can create lasting solutions or lasting structures that manage the issues that it highlights. I think we're seeing a lot of focus on the issue of migration. There's a lot of questions around what are the rules and limits and so on that we should place on this theme. And of course, people have very different views on that, and I don't mean to get into the rights and wrongs of the situation, but as astrologers, we tend to look archetypally, and we look at the sort of broader, what's the broader theme? And the theme, there is pressure on that theme of migration and movement, and that's very Piscean. So Pisces is a sign that we associate with flow, with the ocean, and so on. So this is why we see migration coming up when that sign is highlighted. So I would not be at all surprised to see that kind of theme implicated. And the other thing that we can associate with Pisces is the idea of illusions and imagination, those kind of themes. We're seeing quite a bit of stuff in the news about deep fakes, about fake news that's now being facilitated by AI technology. That's another theme that I wouldn't at all be surprised to see coming up. What's real and what isn't? This is a Piscean in question. So there's a lot going on in that month of April. And in fact, we've talked about these synodic cycles, but there's something else happening as well, which is a solar eclipse in the sign of Aries. So eclipses are always big deals in astrology. Eclipses are always big deals in astrology. So this month, from an astrological perspective, is huge, and I think it's going to be one for the books.
Yes, definitely one for the books. We have a sun, as we mentioned earlier, the total eclipse, the lunar eclipse, solar eclipse is in the new moon, which is both are positioned at 19 degrees of Aries. So the moon is pioneering and in Aries. It's very innovative, very impulsive. The sun in Aries is the starting point. It's the initiator for taking action. So they're in the sign of Mars, being ruled by the sign of Mars, and alongside of that solar eclipse is Chiron, which is what we call a dwarf planet, or let's say asteroid. It's a entity that was literally just discovered in 1977 and the astrological implications of its influence is not that old. So do you want to just talk to our listeners a little bit about Chiron and this conjunction?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this eclipse is that the sun and moon, so that the sun and moon will be conjunct at a solar eclipse. they will be almost exactly conjunct this asteroid Chiron that you mentioned. And it's very rare to see an eclipse that's that tightly aligned with another body like that. So the theme or the themes that we associate with the asteroid Chiron are also likely to play into what we see happening with this eclipse. So what is Chiron? Now, Chiron in Greek myth was a centaur, and Chiron was, according to the myth, was wounded by a poisoned arrow, but Chiron was an immortal. So Chiron was almost permanently wounded. And so one of the things that Chiron symbolizes is the kind of the unhealable wounds that we all bear and carry with us through life. But Chiron was also known as a great teacher and healer. He was also an astrologer. And so Chiron is really the archetype of the wounded healer. When we see Chiron highlighted, we can, in mundane astrology, world astrology, we can often see themes like the kind of like cultural or historical wounds and grievances coming up, like deep wounds to the psyche of countries and nations and peoples. We can also think of themes around healing, around medicine. Those kind of themes can also come up. So it's when we see an eclipse that's conjunct Chiron, we're going to expect that Chironic themes are going to be playing a part both in our own lives and in
collectively.
the world. Yeah.
And in the sign of Aries, which is the sign of the archetype of the warrior that we have, we're all going to be asked to stand up for ourselves, really. And it's interesting, I want to just throw this in here, but the New Zealand mundane chart, the constitutional chart, has Moon in Aries. So, and
Yes.
it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here in the country when that trigger comes up with the eclipse on the 8th, 9th. It's actually on the 9th for all our listeners, on April 9th that it happens at 6:17 in the morning.
Yes, the eclipse is happening very close to the moon placement on the New Zealand chart. And the moon in the chart of a country will tend to signify the people. It's really what it is. So I'm wondering, in the case of New Zealand, if this eclipse and this month is going to bring up themes around woundings related to the people, the ordinary people of New Zealand. I have some other factors that I've looked at that make me wonder if New Zealand is going to be reckoning a little bit with its history, with the legacy of how
of colonization. Yeah.
Yes. That theme seems likely to be highlighted because the colonization is kind of an Aries theme as well. Aries is a pioneering, sort of exploring, swashbuckling kind of sign associated with, and also associated with martial themes, war, and so on. So I'm wondering if those themes might be highlighted in April for New Zealand. Interestingly, not the last Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that happened in 1940 in Taurus. That happened in 1941. The one before that was in 1858. Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, 1858, and in May 1858 actually. And this was the time when the Maori King movement was founded. Now it's interesting that we're getting
getting the new synodic cycle of, yes. Wow, what a great correlation.
And from what I understand, they just had a big meeting last month on the subject of things that the current government of New Zealand is doing. So I think that theme of kind of New Zealand reckoning with its history in that that respect is going to be highlighted in April?
Well, we don't have long to wait, and it's certainly moving quickly enough. So, Dan, your insights about the New Zealand history are remarkable. Just making note that the New Zealand constitutional chart in 1853, and then 5 years later in 1858, with that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and New Zealand is such it's off the land. Even within Maori culture, the land is and water, everything that is earth is so sacred. The myths that deep ancestry from goodness knows could have been Lemuria or the land of Mu in the Pacific, that the peoples that deep ancestral knowledge coming to the fore, because to me Chiron is also about all that knowledge that he carried as a figure, right? Because also the centaur is Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is higher learning and deep learning. So it has been an absolute delight to have this conversation with you today, and I hope you'll come back in the future and we can talk about other interesting topics and helping educate us all on synodic cycles and the beauty and the magic of the cosmos. So all our listeners, I highly recommend you check out World Astrology Report on YouTube and watch Dan's series. He's got a wonderful series that you have about 6 episodes now, called New Age of 2026. And the other fascinating video is why 2024 will be a landmark year. And we'll have links to this in the video below. So whether you know astrology or not, if you're a history buff, you'll enjoy it as well. Dan, you teach and connect the dots with such an expansive, eloquent view. And I feel so privileged to have gotten to know you and share this time and do this episode with you. And I just want to thank you. And I hope that, all of our listeners and viewers will check out your YouTube channel and look at your Substack readings. At the moment, Dan isn't taking any more consulting appointments. He's going to be working on a lot of creative content to educate us further and practice his passion of history and astrology. And I would also like to thank all of you, whether you tuned in by intention or luck, that your star shines brightly. Until next time. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
This program was produced by and first broadcast on Radio Hawke's Bay, your community access media station. Thanks to New Zealand On Air for making this type of programming possible.